After my husband, a retired Army colonel, passed away, my mother-in-law said, "I want the house, the family business, everything he left behind." My attorney urged me to fight. I shook my head. Let her have it. The entire courtroom thought I'd lost my mind. At the final hearing, I signed every document. She smiled like she'd already won. Then the judge closed the file, looked at her attorney, and asked one question. My husband's ashes weren't even cold when she said it. We were standing in my own driveway, casserole dishes still stacked on the porch. Neighbors had been coming by for 2 days, arms loaded with sympathy that becomes food instead of words. She walked up in low heels, black dress still showing the fold lines from the store bag, and stood close enough that I could smell her perfume. She didn't hug me. In 19 years, she rarely had. "The house is family property now," she said. "You understand." She said it the way you'd remind someone about a parking rule, not like her son had been in the ground 6 hours. "The house, the business, everything he built should stay with the family," she continued. I understood something else entirely. In 19 years, she had never once called me family. Not at our wedding, where she'd worn beige to a ceremony where the bride wore white. Not during the 11 days I slept upright in a hospital recliner 2 years earlier, when my husband's heart gave out for the first time. She hadn't visited once. Family was a word she reached for only when there was something to divide. "We can talk another time," I said, and went inside and stood in my kitchen without crying, because I'd already cried everything I had 2 days earlier, kneeling in front of a casket, while a young soldier told me the flag was on behalf of a grateful nation. My husband, colonel, retired Army, 31 years between active duty and the reserves, had been buried with more dignity than most people get in a lifetime. He would have hated a scene at his own funeral. He would have hated the driveway more. I didn't know yet that he'd planned for it. Years in advance, in detail I wouldn't understand for weeks. My attorney came by that evening, a leather folder under his arm. He'd handled 2 of my husband's business contracts and was calm by nature. He sat across from me and set the folder down without speaking. "She's already contacted probate counsel," he said, moving fast. "Of course she has. You have every right to fight this. None of it is simple, but you are not powerless." I looked past him toward the family room, where my husband's recliner still faced a muted television. "Let her have it. Do you want to surrender everything?" I didn't say surrender. "Then what are you saying?" I didn't have a clean answer. Only a memory, 11 years old, of my husband coming home from a legal conference in a strange, quiet mood, carrying a manila folder he'd set on top of the refrigerator and wouldn't let me see. He'd been distracted for about a week. Then one night over dinner, "If anything ever happens to me, don't fight my mother in court. Let her think she's winning. Just sign whatever comes across the table when the time comes. Promise me." I'd laughed at him, asked if he was planning on dying tomorrow. He'd smiled and said he just liked being prepared. 31 years in the Army did that to a person. I made a promise, I told my attorney. I intend to keep it. I've handled probate cases for 24 years. I've never once seen someone this calm after losing a husband and immediately facing a family lawsuit over everything he left behind. "I don't feel calm," I said. That much was true. He left a few minutes later, and the moment his car pulled out, I walked into the closet where my husband's uniform still hung and pressed one of his old field jackets against my face and cried until my knees ached. I didn't know yet what was waiting in that folder. I only knew I'd made a promise, and that keeping it felt like the last thing I could still do for a man who'd spent 31 years keeping every promise he ever made to anyone. The following Sunday, I attended church alone for the first time in over 2 decades. Normally, my husband would have insisted we arrive 15 minutes early. "Running late is disrespectful," he'd say every week. That morning, I sat in the driver's seat a full minute before I could make myself go inside. People meant well. That didn't make it easier. Then came the whispers, pitched just loud enough to be almost accidental. "I heard she's already hired a lawyer." I smiled and kept walking. After the service, my husband's oldest Army friend caught up with me in the parking lot. 18 years of service together, built like an old oak tree, wearing his veteran ball cap the way some men wear a wedding ring. "You gonna tell me what's going on?" "I wish I knew myself." "He would have fought," he said, in the way of men who've spent decades reading danger in other people's faces. "No," I said, smiling a little. "He would have prepared." He nodded once, conceding a point he hadn't expected to concede. "You're right." He didn't push further. Men who'd spent careers in the Army understood that calm wasn't always the absence of a plan. My mother-in-law wasted no time. 3 days after the driveway, she invited half the family to lunch, and by dinner time everyone had heard her version. She knows she can't win. My son built that business and it belongs with his family. Apparently, after 19 years, I no longer counted as family, a category she redefined on an as-needed basis. One afternoon, my neighbor carried over a peach cobbler still warm from her oven. "Are you okay?" "No." I laughed softly. She squeezed my hand. I didn't think so. For a while, we simply stood in the kitchen without talking. Sometimes silence is kinder than advice. A week later, my mother-in-law's SUV was parked across the street when I pulled into my own garage. A real estate agent stood beside her, gesturing toward the flower beds my husband had built. They were measuring my driveway, my front porch. "You saw them?" my neighbor asked minutes later. I did. She was telling the realtor she'd probably remodel the kitchen before Christmas. "You don't seem angry," she said. "Oh, I'm angry." "Then why aren't you stopping her?" I looked toward the workshop out back, dark and quiet, because that's what everyone expects me to do. Instead, every evening after dinner, I unlocked that workshop and sat at my husband's bench. Not to cry anymore. I started organizing military records, maintenance logs, business binders, tax folders, old legal envelopes going back years. He labeled everything, an Army habit he never fully shed. Some nights I stayed out there until nearly midnight, an old radio playing quiet country music while I sorted one folder at a time under a single hanging bulb. A few times I found handwritten reminders tucked inside binders. "Call the parts supplier before Friday." Small, ordinary fragments of an ordinary ordinary life. Word had reached the shop, too. On a Tuesday, 3 longtime employees showed up at my door with a box of donuts, looking sheepish and determined. "We're checking on you," one said. We sat around my kitchen table for nearly an hour, talking about football before anyone mentioned the lawsuit. Finally, one cleared his throat. She visited the factory yesterday, introduced herself as the future owner, asked for a list of employees over 60. The kitchen went very quiet. She said younger workers are cheaper, one of the older machinists said, knuckles pale. "He would have never treated people like that," someone finally said. "No," I said, "he wouldn't have." The oldest one reached across and patted my hand. "We don't care who owns the company. We care who leads it." After they left, I sat alone, thinking about that word. Leadership. My husband used it constantly, always with the same distinction. Not authority, not power, leadership. I understood that whatever was waiting in that workshop wasn't just about protecting a house or a business from a woman who'd never once called me family. It was about protecting the people who depended on both. That night, I went back out to the workshop and didn't stop until well past 1 in the morning. Then one Thursday evening, something slipped out of an old green binder and landed on the workshop floor, face down. It wasn't a bill. It wasn't a supplier contract. When I turned it over, it was a sealed envelope, cream-colored, with my name written across the front in my husband's unmistakable handwriting. I stared at it a long time before I picked it up. My hand didn't feel steady. He always sealed envelopes the old-fashioned way, a habit from decades of sealing classified logistics reports before email made the ritual unnecessary. I wasn't ready to open it that night. I slid it back into the green binder and carried the stack into the house, setting it on the dining room table. Some things deserve a clear mind. I'd learned that bad decisions come from opening important things after midnight. The next morning, I made coffee in his favorite navy blue mug, even though he wasn't there to drink from it. Outside, the maple tree had started dropping leaves in earnest. He used to complain about raking them, then spend the entire afternoon out there anyway. A few days later, my neighbor knocked before breakfast. "You need to come outside." Across the street, my mother-in-law stood with 2 contractors, one holding a clipboard, the other taking measurements with a laser tape. They weren't looking at her own property. They were looking at mine. "Morning," I said, walking across the lawn. She barely glanced at me. "I'll probably remove all of this." "I'm sure you do," I said, and she seemed disappointed I hadn't argued. By Friday, another rumor had made its way back to me. My mother-in-law had already ordered new living room furniture. "She's telling everyone she's moving in before Thanksgiving," my neighbor reported. "Why are you so calm?" I looked out toward the darkened workshop where a green binder sat waiting, and a cream-colored envelope sat inside it, still sealed. "I'm not calm. I've just stopped wasting energy trying to control what other people say." The truth was that every night I lay awake wondering whether I was honoring my husband's memory or making the largest mistake of my adult life. I opened the envelope 2 nights later, at 9 in the evening rather than midnight. My husband had never been one for long speeches, so seeing 3 full pages in his handwriting made my chest tighten. "My darling," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And knowing my mother, she's probably already making your life harder than it needs to be." Despite everything, I laughed out loud. "Still making jokes," I whispered, and kept reading. He wrote about ordinary things first, reminding me to change the furnace filter, telling me not to let anyone talk me into replacing his old pickup truck. Small, practical, deeply him. Then the handwriting shifted, smaller, more deliberate. "You know me well enough to understand I never walked into an operation without preparing an exit plan. Business isn't much different. Operation. Even 12 years into retirement, he'd still thought like an officer. My attorney knows where the important papers are. If something ever feels wrong, ask him to check the blue estate binder, not the green one. Blue binder." I remembered a blue 3-ring binder on the bottom shelf beneath tax boxes. I hadn't opened it. I walked straight out to the workshop despite the cold. There it was, covered in dust. I carried it back and opened it. Inside were copies of trust documents, corporate records, legal correspondence dating back almost 8 years, dense with language I only partially understood. Irrevocable, contingent beneficiary, co-trustee. One page had a small yellow sticky note, review every 5 years, 8 years. The math settled uncomfortably, putting the creation of this almost exactly at the time of that strange, quiet week after the legal conference. The manila folder on the refrigerator. The dinner table promise I'd laughed off as unnecessary. He hadn't just made a promise 11 years ago. He'd started building the entire structure that would eventually make good on it, and kept building it, quietly, for 8 full years. Whatever was in that blue binder had been 8 years in the making, and I hadn't even started to understand why. I called my attorney first thing the next morning, before I'd finished my coffee. "I found something," I said, and he didn't ask a single clarifying question. He arrived within the hour, tie slightly crooked. He sat at my dining room table with the blue binder open, turning pages methodically. The room stayed silent except for the grandfather clock in the hallway. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I watched his expression shift. Confusion, then curiosity, then something like disbelief, his hand pausing mid-turn on a page he'd apparently already read once. "No," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "What is it?" His fingers actually trembled slightly as he turned another page, a tremor I'd never once seen from a man who'd handled contentious estate disputes for over 2 decades without raising his voice. When he finally reached the last page, he removed his glasses. "Your husband didn't hide anything. He documented everything, filed and recorded properly at every step. This isn't a loophole. This is a fully executed, fully compliant estate structure that's been sitting here, valid and enforceable for years." "So what does that mean?" "It means the company may not actually belong to your husband's probate estate." He paused. "And if I'm reading this correctly, neither does your house. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Outside, I heard a school bus roll past. Life continued on, entirely unaware that inside my dining room, something enormous had just shifted. So she may have spent the last month and a half fighting over property that isn't even part of the estate. He gave a slow, careful nod. I need to verify every document independently before I say anything further to anyone. He closed the binder with unusual care. But if these records are valid, the final hearing is going to unfold very differently than anyone currently expects. For the first time since the funeral, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about the specific, quiet smile my husband used to wear every time someone underestimated him. He spent the rest of that morning making calls from my kitchen, verifying recording numbers, building the case file he'd need to present with total confidence. Around noon, he finally set down his pen. Did you know any of this before you told me to let her have everything? I shook my head. I knew he made me promise not to fight her. I knew there was a folder once, a long time ago. I didn't know the scale of it. I looked toward the workshop window. I just knew he wasn't the kind of man who asked for a promise like that without a reason. 21 years of marriage and he never told you the specifics. It should bother me, probably. But it doesn't. Not really. He was protecting me from having to carry a secret I might not have held on to under pressure. From her, from lawyers, from all of it. If I'd known from the start, everyone would have seen it in my face. He considered that. Your husband was either the most trusting man I've ever encountered or the most strategic. Both, I said. He was always both. We spent the rest of that week preparing quietly, while my mother-in-law continued measuring windows and ordering furniture 2 doors down, entirely unaware the ground beneath her plans had already shifted. The final probate hearing was scheduled for 9 on a chilly Tuesday, and I barely slept the night before. Not because I was afraid of my mother-in-law. That fear had quietly drained out of me over the previous weeks. I was afraid of hope instead, which turned out to be far more dangerous. After weeks of believing everything was slipping away, I suddenly had genuine reason to think my husband had protected us all along, and that kind of hope could be dangerous precisely because of how good it felt. If it turned out to be wrong somehow, the fall would hurt twice as much as if I'd simply braced for loss. At 6:30, I made scrambled eggs I couldn't eat. The coffee went cold beside my plate. My attorney had called late the previous evening. I verified every document. They're legitimate. I've cross-checked the county numbers 3 times. A pause. We still have to let the process unfold properly. You're being awfully mysterious, I'd said, managing a small laugh. I learned it from your husband. By the time I reached the courthouse, the hallway outside the probate courtroom was already crowded. More crowded than I'd expected for what was supposed to be a routine final hearing. Neighbors stood in small clusters near the water fountain. A handful of retired veterans from my husband's old post stood near the entrance, hands folded. Longtime employees had taken the morning off, standing together near the doors in their good clothes, looking like men attending a ceremony rather than a legal proceeding. Even my neighbor was there, carrying a travel mug that read, "World's okay, neighbor." She hugged me tightly. You look calm. I've had practice. She pulled back and studied my face. I've also known you long enough to know that look. What look? The one you get when you've already made peace with whatever happens next. I wished, standing there with my heart pounding harder than my expression let on, that she were entirely right. Inside, my mother-in-law looked as though she were attending an awards banquet rather than a probate hearing. Cream-colored designer suit, pearls catching the fluorescent light, a smile that had grown wider with every week since the funeral. Her attorney arranged neatly labeled folders across the counsel table with the brisk efficiency of a man who expected the easiest morning of his professional month. When she spotted me, she walked over, heels clicking in the same rhythm I remembered from my own driveway. I hope there are no hard feelings. There should have been fewer hard words to begin with. She laughed, dismissive. This is simply business. No, I said, shaking my head gently. It stopped being business the day we buried your son. For the first time in 2 months, her smile faltered, just barely, before she recovered it and walked back to her table without another word. The judge entered promptly at 9, and everyone rose together. I sat very still, my attorney beside me, the blue and green binders resting in a leather case at his feet, and I understood in that specific quiet moment that whatever happened next would either confirm I'd honored my husband's final wishes or reveal I'd trusted an old promise over the practical advice of a lawyer with 24 years of experience telling me otherwise. I folded my hands in my lap, took one slow breath, and waited. But after the usual formalities, my mother-in-law's attorney presented her claims with polished confidence. He spoke about family legacy, bloodline, the responsibility of preserving a family business within the family that built it. He used phrases like honoring his memory the right way, each one landing with the smooth cadence of a man who'd delivered some version of this speech before. It was, objectively, an impressive presentation. Then my attorney stood. His opening statement lasted less than 2 minutes. We have no objection to the petition as it relates to assets legally belonging to the probate estate, he said, offering nothing more before sitting. Several people in the gallery exchanged confused glances. Her attorney smiled, the satisfied smile of a man who believed he just heard the other side concede without a fight. The hearing continued. One document after another was placed in front of me, my attorney sliding each page over with a steady rhythm, waiting for my signature before moving to the next. I signed without arguing, without hesitating, because I had already read, 3 weeks earlier at midnight in my own kitchen, the one document that actually mattered. Another document, another signature, another. The scratching of my pen echoed faintly through the silent courtroom. From the corner of my eye, my mother-in-law leaned back, visibly relaxing, folding her hands with the ease of someone who believed the outcome was already secured. She wasn't nervous anymore. She'd stopped being nervous around the 3rd or 4th signature. When the last document reached me, my attorney looked into my eyes for a brief brief moment. "You understand what you're signing?" "I do. You don't have any questions." "I trust my husband," I said, and signed the final page. A murmur spread through the gallery. "She gave up," someone murmured. "I can't believe it," another answered. Her attorney closed his briefcase with a satisfied click. My mother-in-law actually smiled at me directly. Not kindly, but triumphantly. The expression of someone who believed she'd finally won something she'd been chasing for 2 full months. The judge gathered the signed documents into a single file, tapping the edges neatly, and began reading through them quietly, her reading glasses pushed low. The room settled into the restless stillness that fills a space, expecting nothing more than a formality. I sat very still, watching the judge's face rather than my mother-in-law's, because some instinct told me whatever happened next would show up there first. She read for nearly a full minute in complete silence. Then, instead of announcing the ruling everyone had already assumed was coming, she slowly closed the file. She removed her reading glasses and looked up, not toward me, not toward my attorney, but directly across the room at my mother-in-law's attorney. "Counselor," she said, her voice carrying easily through a room gone suddenly silent. "Before I rule, I have one question." I felt my own heartbeat pick up. Beside me, my attorney didn't move, sitting with the calm, prepared stillness of a man who had known this moment was coming. The courthouse clock in the hallway struck 10, the faint chime carrying through the closed doors into a room where absolutely nobody felt inclined to break the silence. "Of course, Your Honor," her attorney said, rising immediately, straightening his jacket. The judge tilted her head. "Did you verify whether every asset listed in your petition is actually part of your client's late husband's probate estate?" "Yes, Your Honor." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she opened a smaller folder that had been sitting there, largely unnoticed. She studied one page, then another, taking her time in a way that made the silence stretch uncomfortably. "Are you certain?" For the first time all morning, his confidence flickered. He glanced across the room toward my mother-in-law, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. "Yes, Your Honor," he said again, though his voice had lost some certainty. The judge slowly removed her reading glasses. "Interesting." The judge addressed him directly for the first time all morning, using his own name, and something in my chest tightened at hearing it. "Were you aware that the company was transferred into an irrevocable trust over 7 years ago?" He blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The trust. Were you aware it existed?" Silence. He quickly opened one of his binders, flipping through section after section, his composure fraying with each page that failed to produce what he was searching for. Across the aisle, my mother-in-law leaned toward him. "What is she talking about?" He didn't answer. He couldn't, apparently, because he genuinely didn't know. "And were you also aware," the judge continued, "that the residence was conveyed into that same trust during the same transaction?" My heart was pounding so loudly I genuinely wondered whether the people beside me could hear it. "Your Honor, those documents were never presented during discovery. I have no record of any trust in the materials my office received." My attorney stood, unhurried, and handed a certified copy to the clerk. "They were recorded with the county 7 years ago. The recording information and filing stamps are attached to the final page." The judge compared it carefully before nodding once, decisively. "They match." A quiet murmur rolled through the courtroom. My mother-in-law grabbed her attorney's arm. "What is this?" I don't know." "No. You told me everything was part of the estate. You told me this would be simple. That's what the petition indicated based on the information you provided." "Counselor, did you independently verify title before asking this court to distribute these assets?" "I relied on the information provided by my client." The judge nodded slowly, making a brief note in the margin. "This court cannot distribute property that is not legally owned by the estate, regardless of any family expectation. The law is specific on this point." My mother-in-law's confident smile had disappeared completely. She looked from the judge to her attorney, and then finally toward me, and for the first time since the funeral, she looked genuinely, visibly frightened. I wish I could say the moment felt like victory. Mostly I simply felt tired, the bone-deep exhaustion of weeks spent holding a secret I hadn't fully understood myself. But my husband had once told me something while we were repainting the porch railing on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. "Truth doesn't always arrive first," he'd said. "Sometimes it takes the long road." Sitting in that courtroom, I understood, more fully than I had in 2 months, exactly what he'd meant. Nobody left the courtroom. Everyone seemed to sense they were witnessing something unexpected. "Counselor, please explain the trust structure for the record." My attorney stood and retrieved the blue binder. "My client's husband established this trust a little over 7 years ago. It was reviewed and amended periodically, properly recorded with the county at every stage. Upon his death, the trust became the sole legal owner of both the residence and the company. No, the trust names 3 co-trustees, each required for any major decision. Read the names into the record," the judge said. My attorney read them one at a time. Me. Every eye in the courtroom turned. Then the oldest employee's name. A muffled gasp came from behind me, him clearly hearing it for the first time. And finally, the county's Veterans Community Foundation. The courtroom filled with a low, startled murmur. I turned and nodded at him, because I hadn't known either, not until that exact moment. "The trust requires unanimous approval from all 3 trustees before the business can be sold, dissolved, or relocated outside the county." "What conditions?" the judge asked. "The company must continue operating within the county. It must maintain its existing veteran hiring program and retain no fewer than 80% of its full-time employees through any transition." Behind me, someone whispered, "That's him. Exactly him." Even the judge allowed herself a small smile. "So he intended to protect both the business and the people working within it." "Exactly, Your Honor." My mother-in-law leaned toward her attorney. "There has to be something. The trust appears valid on its face." "Appears? I need you to review it further. Now," the judge said, not unkindly but firmly. "This court cannot disregard legally executed executed trust documents simply because the outcome is not what you had hoped for. My son would never cut me out entirely. He didn't, my attorney said. The room quieted. The trust provides her with a one-time distribution of $50,000, along with continued access to the family cemetery plot arrangements and a standing invitation to visit the family home on request for as long as the current trustee resides there. $50,000, she said, caught entirely off guard. He also included a personal letter explaining the reasoning behind these specific terms. The judge read silently for nearly a full minute. I'm not going to read this aloud. It was clearly intended as a private message. She looked out across the courtroom. But I will say this. This man devoted considerable thought to ensuring his family, his employees, and his community were all cared for after his death in a manner that balanced compassion with clear enforceable boundaries. The judge signed several orders before closing the file. The claims seeking full ownership of the company and the family residence are denied. Those assets are not part of the probate estate, and this court has no authority to distribute them as such. Her gavel struck once, sharp and final. For the first time in nearly 2 months, I felt like I could genuinely breathe again. But even as the room began to stir back to life around me, some small, quiet part of me kept returning to a detail the judge had mentioned almost in passing. A letter attached to the trust 7 years ago, explaining the specific terms my husband had chosen for his own mother. I didn't know yet that the actual reason my husband had built this entire structure had nothing to do with abstract family greed. It had everything to do with something specific my mother-in-law had done years earlier that I wouldn't learn until that evening, with a second envelope I hadn't even known existed. When the hearing ended, nobody rushed for the exit. People stayed in their seats a long moment, almost as though they needed time to process what they'd just watched. My mother-in-law remained seated for several minutes, staring down at the table, her posture entirely different from the confident bearing she'd carried in that morning. Her attorney packed his files without speaking, avoiding eye contact with everyone, including, it seemed, her. My attorney gathered our documents. You all right? I think so. You don't sound entirely convinced. I've been carrying this weight for weeks. It feels strange, not having it anymore. Some victories don't make you want to celebrate, he said. They just let you breathe again. Outside, the November air felt sharper, the sky that hard blue that only shows up in late fall. A small group of local reporters had gathered near the steps. One recognized my mother-in-law immediately. Do you have a comment on today's ruling? She glanced toward her attorney. He shook his head. Another pressed on. Did you know the company wasn't part of the estate before today? No answer. For what might have been the first time in 19 years of knowing her, she genuinely seemed to have nothing to say. The reporters turned toward me instead. Many people expected a long legal battle, one said. Instead, today ended very differently. How do you feel? Relieved, I said, and meant it, even though the word felt incomplete for everything sitting in my chest. Do you consider today's outcome a victory? I looked across the parking lot where several employees waited near an old pickup truck, watching from a respectful distance. I think my husband would be happy. And your mother-in-law? I watched her climb into a car at the curb. I truly hope she finds peace. My attorney glanced at me, surprised. That wasn't the answer anyone was expecting. One of the longtime employees caught up with us. I still can't believe he made me a trustee. Neither can I. He laughed, disbelieving. You know what the first thing everyone asked me was? What? Are we all keeping our jobs? I told them yes. He paused. Thank you. For what? For never treating any of us like we were just employees. All these weeks, and you kept showing up, kept being honest even when you couldn't promise us anything. My throat tightened. Your colonel taught me that. No, he said. He showed you. You're the one who chose to actually live it. I drove home alone, windows cracked despite the cold, needing the air the way I had every difficult morning over the past 2 months. I didn't know yet that the day's most significant revelation hadn't happened in that courtroom at all. It was waiting for me at home, inside a small fireproof lockbox I hadn't even known existed, tucked behind a false panel in my husband's closet, a place I would only discover because of an offhand comment my son made that evening, something small he'd known about for months without realizing its significance. That evening, I made dinner for the first time in weeks that didn't feel like an obligation. Roast chicken and vegetables, the kitchen filling with a warmth that had felt absent since September. My son, 13 and quiet in the particular way boys that age often go quiet, sat at the table doing homework while I cooked. Partway through setting the table, he said something that stopped me entirely. Is Grandma really not getting the house? No, sweetheart. The house belongs to a trust now. Something your dad set up a long time ago to keep it safe. He nodded, then added, almost offhandedly, in the tone of a teenager, mentioning something he'd genuinely forgotten was significant. Dad showed me the box behind his shirts once, said if anything ever happened, I should tell you to check it, but only after everything with Grandma was over. He made me promise not to say anything before then. I set down the dish towel. What box? In his closet, behind the panel that pops out, under where he kept his dress uniforms. I stood very still, staring at my son, a boy who had apparently been carrying a secret instruction from his father. How long ago did he show you this? He shrugged. A while ago, before he got sick again. Maybe a year? A year. My husband had shown our 13-year-old a hidden compartment roughly a year before he died, extracted a promise of silence, and trusted it to hold for however long the legal process took. I left the chicken half-carved and walked straight to the bedroom, my son trailing behind me. He reached past the hanging clothes toward the back wall, pressing against a section of paneling I'd walked past 1,000 times without ever suspecting it wasn't simply part of the wall. It gave slightly, then swung open, revealing a shallow, recessed space and a small fireproof lockbox, gray, unremarkable. I lifted it out. It was heavier than I expected. Do you know the combination? He shook his head. He never told told me that part. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried the obvious combinations. Our anniversary, my son's birthday, my husband's own birthday. Fingers trembling with each failed attempt. None of them worked. Then I remembered the yellow sticky note. Review every 5 years. I tried the year the trust was created. Nothing. Finally, I tried a date I hadn't consciously thought about in years. The exact date, 7 years and 1 week earlier, of a phone call I remembered only vaguely. A strange, tense evening when my husband had come home from visiting his mother alone, something he almost never did, and had been unusually quiet the rest of that night. The lock clicked open. Inside, beneath a folded American flag and a small stack of photographs, sat a second sealed envelope, thicker than the first, my name written across the front in the same handwriting, along with a line I hadn't seen on the first envelope. Read this one only after the trust has held. Only after you understand I was protecting you, not just from her greed, but from something I should have told you years ago. I sat on the edge of that bed a long time before opening it, my son standing quietly in the doorway. Go finish your homework, sweetheart, I told him gently. I'll come get you when dinner's ready. He nodded and left, and I sat alone in the bedroom my husband and I had shared for 2 decades, holding an envelope that I somehow already understood was going to change how I understood everything that had happened over the past 2 months. My darling, if you're reading this, it means the trust held, and you finally understand why I needed it to. I owe you the full truth now. The part I could never quite bring myself to say out loud while I was alive, because saying it meant admitting something about my own family I wasn't ready to carry in the open. 7 years ago, I drove out to see my mother alone, something I rarely did without you, and found her going through old boxes in her garage. One held paperwork from around the time you and I had first started seriously discussing the business, when every financial decision felt enormous. Inside was a copy of a life insurance policy I'd taken out on myself when our son was born. Attached to it was a set of documents I'd never seen before. Never signed, never authorized. Paperwork attempting to name her, rather than you, as the primary beneficiary. Dated from a period when I'd briefly used a financial advisor she'd recommended, a family friend I'd trusted without properly vetting. I want to be careful here because I don't want you to think worse of that chapter of our lives than the facts support. The attempt didn't succeed. The advisor, when I confronted him years later, admitted he'd drafted the paperwork at her request, but the version that would have changed the beneficiary never went through. But she had tried. She had sat across from a man she trusted and asked him to quietly redirect money meant for your protection and our son's future toward herself instead. I confronted her that afternoon in her garage, and she didn't deny it. She told me, without any apparent shame, that she'd only been trying to make sure the money stayed close to family. The same phrase she used on you in our driveway the day I died. I didn't tell you at the time, and I still don't fully know if that was the right choice. You were pregnant with our daughter that year, and I told myself I was protecting you from unnecessary stress over something that hadn't succeeded. What I did instead, over the following months, was quietly begin building something she couldn't attempt again, no matter how she tried, no matter what advisor she found next. I met with an attorney I'd served with, someone I trusted completely, and we began constructing the trust, reviewing it every 5 years the way I reviewed everything that mattered. I never told you because I didn't want you carrying the weight of knowing your mother-in-law had once tried to take something meant for you and our children. I know now that may have been the wrong choice. Keeping secrets, even protective ones, is still a kind of weight, and I placed that weight entirely on myself for 7 years. I'm sorry for that. I asked our son to show you where this box was, once he was old enough to understand the instruction without understanding the reason behind it, because I wanted this final piece of the truth to reach you only after you'd had the chance to see, on your own, exactly how thoroughly I'd protected you. You were never required to fight her. I fought her 7 years ago, quietly, permanently, in the only way I knew how that wouldn't require you to ever look your mother-in-law in the eye and accuse her of something she'd have simply denied anyway. I've got you. I always did. I just made sure it would still be true even after I couldn't say it to you myself. All my love, always, your husband. I read the letter twice before I could fully absorb it, then sat on the edge of our bed a long time afterward. I didn't cry immediately, which surprised me. 7 years. He had known for 7 years, carried this specific knowledge through every holiday dinner, and never once let it show. I finally understood why he'd always been slightly reserved with her. I hadn't known he was carrying an actual betrayal, one he'd chosen to absorb entirely alone. Eventually, I did cry, layered with something close to anger on his behalf, and underneath both, a strange, complicated tenderness for a man who had decided, 7 years earlier, that protecting my peace of mind was worth carrying an ugly secret entirely by himself. I looked, finally, at the photographs beneath the letter. Old, faded, my husband as a much younger man. On the back of one, in his mother's handwriting, were my son, who always understood money better than sentiment. My son knocked softly. Is dinner still happening? I wiped my face and managed a small, genuine smile. Yes, sweetheart. 5 minutes. I didn't tell him what was in the letter that night, and I still haven't told him everything, even now, months later. Later that evening, I called my attorney, apologizing for the hour. I found something else, something that changes some of what I understood about all of this. Do you need to discuss it professionally or personally? There's nothing left to do legally. This is the part where I understand why he built it in the first place. That's not nothing, he said gently. Sometimes understanding the why matters just as much as winning the what. Winter arrived quietly that year. There were still insurance forms, meetings with accountants, considerably more trust paperwork than I could have imagined. Every Tuesday afternoon, the oldest employee and I sat together in what used to be my husband's office, slowly learning a role neither of us had asked for but both had inherited together. together. The employees noticed the shift. Nobody worried anymore about losing their job. A few weeks before Memorial Day, an envelope arrived with my mother-in-law's return address on it. I stared at it nearly 10 minutes before opening it. It read, considerably shorter than either of my husband's letters. I spent so much time trying to hold on to what he had built that I forgot, somewhere along the way, to actually appreciate who he was while he was still here. I can't undo what I did all those years ago, and I understand now that he knew, and that he spent years quietly protecting all of you from me because of it. I don't expect forgiveness. I only wanted you to know that I'm sorry. There was no signature, no request for a response. Some apologies don't erase the past, but they can keep bitterness from following you forward. On Memorial Day morning, I drove out to the cemetery carrying fresh white roses, the same kind my husband had always brought me on our anniversary, 21 years running. I found his grave without needing to check a map. I always could. I knelt down and placed the roses beside the stone. For a while, I simply stood there. No speeches prepared, just a quiet, settled gratitude that had taken 2 full seasons to finally arrive. I understand now, I said quietly. You weren't just protecting the money. A faint breeze moved through the trees. You were protecting the people, all of us, even from the people who were supposed to protect us too. The house had never simply been a house. The company had never simply been a business. His greatest legacy had never been measured in dollars, or trust documents, or courtroom victories, but in the people still standing, still steady, still protected, because he had cared enough 7 quiet years in advance to make certain they would be. I stood at that grave a while longer, then drove home to my children, to a house that had always, in every way that actually mattered, belonged to us.